welcome to the Plant School Podcast. I'm Rachel Tenney, and here we learn all about plants, how they work, how to care for them, and it's all taught in a way that anyone, from beginner to expert, can listen to, understand, and enjoy. So I hope that you will join me in Plant School. Hello and welcome to the Plant School Podcast. I am so excited for today's episode. I had an interview with Barbara Batakova. She's an author of a new book called Hunting Mushrooms, and it's a beginner's guide to how to hunt for mushrooms. So today's episode is going to give you all you need to know about starting out going mushroom hunting. This is something that I had never really thought about, but after talking with Barbara and reading her book, it is definitely something that I am going to do. I'm going to go mushroom hunting. And I hope you guys feel the same way after listening to her with all the knowledge that she has to share. Before I dive into today's interview, I do want to do our giveaway. So I do this every single episode. I choose 2 giveaway winners. One of the giveaway winners comes from Spotify, someone who has answered the most recent episode's question. They're just fun little questions. There's no right or wrong answers. And then I also choose someone who has left a review on Apple Podcasts. So you can do either one. You can do both. And you can answer those Spotify questions as many times as you'd like. What you win as a giveaway winner is a bottle of Prop Drops, which is like a liquid aid to your water propagations. You literally take these Prop Drops, drop a few drops into your water propagations, and it really helps them. I've used it, so I know that they actually work, and I'm so excited that they are here sponsoring the Plant School Podcast, and they will also send you a bottle of Leaf Shine, which I have also used and also love. And if you would like to check out any of those products and you aren't the giveaway winner, you just want to go look at them, I have a code for you. So go to marketbotany.com/shop and you can use the code Plant School Podcast. No capital letters, no spaces. Plant School Podcast will give you a discount for your order from Market Botany. So let's start with the review from Apple Podcasts. Their username is Ultimo, and they said, "This podcast is just what I'm looking for as I expand my plant collection and really up my propagations. I've shared this show with friends and family after listening to several episodes. I'd really like to learn more about ferns and pests." Hey, we just did an episode about ferns. And it continues, "I just bought a couple secondhand plants that came with hosts. I treated and isolated. Thankfully, I haven't had to deal with pests before, but when I began encountering these, I feared for my other plants." I've been there. "Thank you for all your help and wide scope you show with the history, meaning, importance, care, and growth of plants. Will keep recommending." Thank you so much for that kind review, Ultimo. If that was you that left that review, go ahead and email me at tenneyplants@gmail.com, TENNEY plants@gmail.com. And then moving over to Spotify, last episode was the Fern Care Guide, and I asked you guys, do you own a fern? If so, what kind? And our winner today, their username is Centurion Cross. They said, "My sister has a white rabbit's foot fern and a Boston fern. I haven't been brave enough to get any for myself yet. They're super cute, and I think this episode gave me the courage to get one." I'm so glad to hear that. I hope it gives you the courage to get one because they are such fun plants. And maybe your sister can even give you some tips that maybe I didn't even cover in that episode. But if that was you, Centurion Cross, you go ahead and email me as well at tenneyplants@gmail.com. I will get you guys that little package from Market Botany sent your way. And again, if you want to check out their shop, go to marketbotany.com/shop and use code Plant School Podcast. And without further ado, let's get into our interview with Barbara Batakova. All right, welcome to the Plant School Podcast. Today, I am super excited. We have Barbara here, who is the author of Hunting Mushrooms, How to Safely Identify, Forage, and Cook Wild Fungi. And just like a little bit about your life, Barbara, I hope you don't mind. I was kind of looking at your website and everything. I found it interesting that you grew up kind of involved with mushrooms, but when you went and did your studies, you were very interested in other things. Like you were interested in photography and art. You got your master's degree in design and communication planning and information design. It all kind of led you back eventually to fungi, which is so interesting to me. I love how your grandmother played a huge part in that. And I'm so excited to spend some time today with you and learn more about mushrooms, but also learn more about you and how you kind of came to all of this. Usually, my first question on this podcast is, how did you first become interested in plants? But fungi are very different. So my question for you is, how did you first become interested in fungi? How did that come about?
Yeah, well, hello everybody, and thank you, Rachel, for having me. I'm super excited to talk about mushrooms and fungi to you all. So, how did I first become interested in fungi? So, as you mentioned, I grew up mushroom hunting in the Czech Republic, which is where I'm from. That's where I was born. And Czech Republic is culturally a mycophilic country. So that kind of means that we're not afraid of mushrooms. Like mushrooms are part of our culture. Some would even call it's a national sport. It's really sort of embedded in a lot of people's lives because it's a favorite pastime to do in the fall over the weekend, to go mushroom hunting and into the woods and to spend some time in nature as well. So that's how I got started. And then, as you mentioned, I moved to the United States to go to school, and I was focused on design and design thinking and sort of studying communication. And when I sort of built my career, I was sort of asking myself, like, well, what's next? What's next for me? Because I have sort of achieved a lot of the goals that I have set for myself. And I was kind of looking for something else. And I also started to miss home, and I was looking for ways to get grounded again. I began hiking in a local park, and I started taking photographs of mushrooms because before I studied photography, but primarily my focus was on flowers, plants actually. And so, because I was always fascinated by their colors and their shapes, and that is true for mushrooms as well. So when I started photographing mushrooms, I started to also learn about mushrooms in Pennsylvania because they are different from what we have in the Czech Republic. There are lots of similarities, but also lots of differences. And I started educating people about mushrooms through Instagram. And that kind of blew up a little bit. It mushroomed overnight, you could say. And lots of people were really responding to what I was doing. So that's how I started Fungi Woman here in the States. And then it just sort of took off. And I joined a local mushroom club here in Pennsylvania, the Western Pennsylvania Mushroom Club, and I became an official identifier for the club. And now I'm actually serving as president for the club as well.
Yeah, and I last time I looked, I think you're at like 127,000 followers on Instagram. So if any of you listening want to learn more about fungi, I highly recommend following Fungi Woman on Instagram. You take such beautiful photos. You can really tell that you do have such like a knack for taking these close-ups of these fungi.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So, and then, last sort of big milestone in my mushroom journey so far has been writing a book. So, about a year and a half ago, I got approached with an offer to write a book about mushrooms. And I made that happen with the help of a wonderful publisher and everybody at Page Street Publishing. So, I am really grateful, and the book is now out. So, that is something that I'm really proud of.
Yeah, and I've been so lucky to have your book and read it, and it really is like something to be so proud of. I think you've done an amazing job. Me, as someone who didn't know much about fungi, was so helpful as like an introductory guide. I feel like I I actually understand them now, which is amazing. And it kind of leads me to my first question because I feel like this is something so misunderstood. Plants and fungi, they're like two completely separate worlds. Could you tell like listeners who may not be familiar with this, what is the difference between plants and fungi?
Yeah, absolutely. So fungi are a diverse group of eukaryotic organisms that are found in almost every ecosystem on Earth. You can find them in soil, but also in water. We have some aquatic fungi as well, to all the way to like insides of living organisms like other plants. And they can be as tiny as a single cell yeast, or they can also be very complex and sort of form a mushroom, what we know as a mushroom. So when we talk about fungi, we usually mean the entire organism. And mushroom is really just the fruiting body that contains the reproductive structures for that organism. And so it's kind of like a mushroom is similar to an apple, where if you pick a mushroom, you're not really killing the organism. So that's kind of a general intro what fungi is. But for a long time, fungi were considered to be plants because they were stationary. So they were kind of observed in similar ways as opposed to animals. But fungi are actually more close to animals. So one of the big differences is sort of in the cellular structure. So fungi have cell walls made of chitin, which is this tough, flexible compound that is also found in the exoskeletons of insects, as opposed to plants obviously have cell walls made of cellulose. So that is one of their big difference. And the other difference is the really how they make food. So the nutritional mode, you could say. So fungi are heterotrophic organisms, meaning they cannot produce their own food. The way they obtain nutrients is by decomposing organic matter. They also form symbiotic relationships with other plants, or they are parasites on other organisms. And they do this by excreting enzymes into their environment to break them down, to kind of break these complex organic materials into simpler compounds, which they then absorb. Now, plants, on the other hand, they make their own food. They are autotrophic. So they perform photosynthesis and chloroplasts, which contain chlorophyll. And so through this process, they convert light energy into chemical energy, which is then stored in glucose. So, in other words, they use sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide to create oxygen and energy, and they kind of store it in the form of sugar. So, that is another biggie. And then the last big difference is how they reproduce. So, fungi reproduce through spores, which they can be asexual or sexual. And spores are then dispersed by wind, water, or animals, whereas plants reproduce also sexually through seeds, through fertilization of eggs in flowers or cones, or also asexually through other methods like propagation and things like that. So those are kind of the three major differences. And you could also add sort of one more, which is more of an ecological role, where fungi are kind of primarily decomposers of things, whereas plants are kind of producers of things.
Yeah, thank you so much for like laying that all out. You explained it so well. And I've wanted to ask you this. So in your book, Coming from the Czech Republic to the US, found that the US, we were quite afraid of mushrooms in general. And so I wanted to ask you, why do you think that is?
Yeah, so generally you can talk about mycophilic countries and mycophobic countries. Historically, English-speaking countries have been leaning towards mycophobic, so that's where people are afraid of mushrooms. Whereas places like Asia and Central and Eastern Europe, they are not afraid of mushrooms. And I think this is primarily cultural. This is just sort of how you grow up, how these things are sort of instilled into you from the very beginning. And they're sometimes hard to get over, or to kind of break those beliefs that we have, that we learn as children. And mushrooms are sort of these mysterious organisms that literally kind of appear out of nowhere. They grow in these dark places. They kind of mysteriously appear sometimes. So like there's really not much predicting to it, although there is obviously some signs you can look for. But I think mushrooms have this aura of mysteriousness around them, which contributes, I think, to this fear. And then the other thing is just the lack of understanding. I think generally people are afraid of things that they're not familiar with. And mushrooms and fungi are things that I think are not, again, I think because of cultural differences, you don't really encounter them or you don't really talk about mushrooms that much. And so if you kind of don't grow up mushroom foraging or kind of being that part of your life, then you don't really have a reason to be particularly familiar with mushrooms and kind of be learning about them more. But I think that attitude is absolutely changing. I think a lot of people, especially during COVID, were looking for safe ways to spend time outside. And lots of people headed into local parks and woods and forests, and they started to notice things around them. And so the more you kind of learn more about a subject, I think the less afraid you are. And I think that's true for mushrooms as well.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like as I read your book, I could feel myself becoming more comfortable with mushrooms because, like you
Mhm.
mentioned, it wasn't a cultural background for me to go mushroom
Yeah.
hunting. I'm not very familiar with them, and it does create quite a bit of fear. But as I was reading your book, I'm like, you know what? Maybe I could do this. And it does not sound like nearly as scary or fearful as I thought it needed to be.
That's
So kind
fair.
of yeah, yeah. So I really do like appreciate your book and what you're doing and also being on this podcast. I feel like this is also helpful for people to hear more about them and realize that mushrooms really, they're great and they're nothing to be afraid of. Do you have like any other tips of how people could get over what you call like a mycophobia?
Sure. I think, the same tips would be for mushroom foraging as well, which is, join a local club and start getting out there and start observing and, surround yourself with people that know more than you do, experts, and just hang out with people that want to learn the same things that you do. And that's really it. I think people need to be, in order to start to kind of overcome that fear, I think everybody has to find a reason to do that. So people are interested in mushrooms for different reasons, and I think will guide sort of how to get over that fear as well. But it's primarily through education and acquiring more information.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great segue because I kind of want to go into more about mushrooms. In the like introduction to your book, you talk quite a bit about how fungi is crucial to life on Earth. So, in your opinion, how is it crucial to us and life here on Earth?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think it really speaks to the importance of fungi and why a lot of people should learn more about them, because they really do have lots of important uses. So, first of all, fungi are the reason that there is actually other life. Like they kind of started it all. So, about 1 billion years ago, fungi began to colonize rock in the forms of lichens, which are symbiotic arrangements between fungi and algae or cyanobacteria. And so these lichens played a significant role in breaking down rocks and forming the first soils, which then allowed plants to leave water. And at first, they used fungi as their root systems to kind of transport nutrients and uptake water until they evolved their own. So that's sort of number one. So I think, we have to thank fungi that we're even here on Earth, because they kind of kickstarted that whole life on Earth outside of water. But in addition to that, I see them as, first of all, kind of maintaining the cycle of life as well. So they are decomposers. So fungi are the only organisms that can break down cellulose. So they sort of break down complex organic materials like dead plants, animals, and waste products into simpler substances that other organisms can use, whether it's plants or animals. And so they play this important role in nutrient recycling, which literally means that they help maintain the cycle of life. The other thing is that they help other life forms. So fungi make mycorrhizal associations and relationships with plant roots. This is known as mycorrhizae. And we now know that trees cannot thrive or even exist without their mycorrhizal partners. And so these fungi in general enhance the plant's ability to absorb water and nutrients, and there is an exchange of nutrients that's happening. And then also these mycorrhizal networks function as these giant information networks as well. So plants can communicate with each other through chemical signals that travel through these mycorrhizal networks. So this is a concept that's called the Wood Wide Web. It was discovered by Dr. Suzanne Simard, and I highly recommend this book as well. It's called The Mother Tree. And there she sort of describes how really plants couldn't live without fungi. And they also help with plant health. So they protect the plants from pathogens. They sort of help increase their stress tolerance as well. But on the other hand, other fungi can also act as parasites to some plants as well. So it's really interesting to see how, like, fungi can be helpful to plants and even vital, but in other ways they are also plant pathogens. So it really is fascinating in that regard. The other ways is we can sort of look at them as providing ecological stability. So they help improve soil structure because they bind soil particles together through the mycelium. So this enhances kind of soil aeration, water retention, and it's just sort of generally supports plant growth as well. I think the most obvious one is that they serve as food and medicine for a lot of people. So they can serve as a sustainable food source, and also a lot of they have a lot of bioactive compounds that can be used to make medicine. And finally, I would say they also have a lot of industrial applications. So there's a lot of research that's currently being done where fungi are used in bioremediation. Sometimes there's a term that they call mycoremediation to clean up contaminated environments. So things like oyster mushrooms are studied in this regard, and they can degrade pollutants and pesticides and heavy metals and things like that. So they're they're really powerful in that way. And then finally, we can make clothing out of mycelium. We can also make furniture out of mycelium and or mushrooms as well. And then there are also art application where actually my relatives back in the Czech Republic, they are product designers, and they use mycelium to create molds for glass. And so they blow glass into a form made of mycelium. So the applications really are endless. It's, even the last one I will mention is, Paul Stamets, who was one of the most famous American mycologists. He is researching how fungi can help save bees by increasing their immune system to the disease that's killing them. So,
Wow.
never end.
Yeah, there are so many uses. I have not heard of many of those. Like, making furniture, making clothes, helping with like glass blowing. I had no idea. That is amazing.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, and this is like purely just like Rachel's curiosity. So I took note of this. You mentioned in your book there's roughly 2.2 to 6.2 million species of fungi. Just to like
Hmm.
give the listeners a comparison, there's only 391 species of known plants. So there's a lot of them. And
Yeah.
only about 150,000 have been discovered, and about 1,800 are discovered every single year. So, my question for you is, do you like have any interest in finding and describing and like naming a new species? Is that something that's ever been on your mind?
It's a really good question. So, I mean, of course, it would be amazing to be able to describe a new species of a mushroom, but I personally don't believe I have the qualifications to do so. In order to do that, you really have to be able to do DNA analysis and DNA barcoding. So that's
Mm,
really how we discover new species these days. So, way back when we relied on morphological characteristics to describe mushrooms. And what happened is that a lot of these descriptions came from Europe. So when we started to look at and document mushrooms and fungi here in North America, a lot of the European names were applied to these species. Then, microscopy then led to some new discoveries, potentially based on spore characteristics or other kind of microscopic finds. But really, the truest way to differentiate species now is to do DNA barcoding. And while DNA barcoding is becoming more and more accessible and more cost effective through some of these newly developed protocols, it is still a very specialized process that requires a lot of biology and chemistry knowledge. And so you have to be absolutely trained in that or spend a significant amount of time to understand these concepts. And then just because we now uncover different species through DNA barcoding, because we're comparing the DNA sequences to other sequences, and when they don't match, that's basically when we say, like, okay, this is a new species. It still needs to be reliably described. So then it kind of needs to go back to, okay, what are the morphological characteristics of this mushroom, and what is the habitat, and how do we describe it in relation to these other species as well? And so then that requires a publication in a research journal, has to be obviously peer reviewed, and so it follows sort of some level of academic rigor in order to be accepted as a new species.
interesting. I had no idea that it got so like nitty gritty down to the DNA. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so to kind of like start with like the main piece of your book, which is, hunting mushrooms, where
Mhm.
do you start when you are identifying a mushroom? You see it out in the wild or you see it in your grass. How do you go about figuring out what it is?
Yeah, so there are sort of 8 aspects of sort of mushroom identification that you can kind of go through, and some of these are more accessible than others. The two most complicated ones are, of course, microscopy and DNA barcoding. But the first thing to really notice is where the mushroom grows. So it's really the habitat that you want to take note of and make sure that you sort of understand. So that's number one. Number two is you notice how the mushroom grows. So does it grow on the ground or does it grow directly on wood? So when we sort of talk about, those are the two major ways that fungi live. There are other sort of ways as well that I kind of dig deeper in the book, like lichens, one of them. But primarily, when you're kind of looking and you're trying to identify what we usually understand as a mushroom, you kind of want to look at if it's growing on the ground or if it's growing on wood. Now, mushrooms can be tricky sometimes. So even though the mushroom might look like it's growing from the ground, it might be growing from buried wood. So you kind of want to make sure that you can determine that. And then you kind of move into the morphology. So you look at, what does it look like? What does the cap look like? What does the stipe look like? Does it have ornamentation on the stipe? Like, are there, does it have, like, I would say, like, decorations on the stipe? Does it have a ring? Does it have a vulva at the bottom? What does the underside of the cap look like? Does it have gills? Does it have pores? Or maybe it's perfectly smooth, or maybe it just has some ridges, like chanterelles do. So that's what you kind of look at. And that's what a lot of people use to identify sort of fungi. And you can identify a lot of things just through these three characteristics. So habitat, ecology, and then morphology. Now, as you sort of dig deeper, and that doesn't give you enough information, you can also leverage smell and taste. But that is definitely for more advanced foragers, because while you can taste any mushroom, even the deadly toxic ones, and you spit it out, you will not die. But obviously, that is not recommended, and we should not do that. So, in order to even determine whether you can use smell and taste to help you gather some information about the mushroom, you already need to know quite a bit to even determine if this is safe for you to do, because there's no reason to be risky about it. And then we're starting to get into a bit more advanced, although, the spore print, that is a big identifying characteristic as well. So mushrooms drop spores from underneath their caps. And when you capture, like, by themselves, these spores are tiny, tiny. But when you make a spore print, which means you just kind of place the cap of the mushroom on glass or on paper and you let it drop the spores, then millions of them will accumulate on the glass or paper, and then you will be able to tell their color. And that can give you an important piece of information as well. And then, mycologists also use, or some amateur mycologists and advanced sort of mycophiles, you can also leverage chemical reactions. So, primarily you can use ammonium hydroxide or iron sulfate or potassium hydroxide and drop a little bit of these chemicals onto the mushroom and see if there's like a color change. And then the last two are microscopic features and D-analysis, which are largely inaccessible to a lot of us. So
yeah, the average Joe doesn't have that hanging around their house.
exactly.
How long would you say does it take for someone who is like completely clueless on mushrooms to become comfortable in identifying just like the more common mushrooms around them? How long would that timeline be that you've seen personally?
I don't think you can say. I
Okay.
think that depends on your commitment and your amount of time that you're able to dedicate to it. We literally have a mycologist in our club that learned everything in 3 years. And
Wow.
she is now an expert, in so many species. And so when I found out, I was blown away. I was like, that is very impressive, because that to me represented, like, I thought she studied mushrooms all her life. And to learn that she was able to accomplish that in like 3 or 4 years was just quite amazing. That's kind of one extreme. On the other hand, I think, I feel like within a year, you can sort of start to understand and recognize kind of major groups of mushrooms. And it's all about practice and getting out there. So, like, the more you're out there, the more mushrooms you see, the more you will learn. So it really just does depend. But the important piece is to not just study books, which that obviously does help. And that's sort of what I was aiming for with my book. where I sort of introduce people to some of the major mushroom groups and tell you a little bit about their characteristics and how do you kind of tell an amanita from a chanterelle from a bolete. And once you sort of get this baseline understanding, that's when you need to start getting out there and seeing on your own.
Yeah, I love that. So it kind of definitely depends on the person and what kind of commitment you
Yeah.
put into it. So, what kind of mushrooms would you recommend for beginners when they start going out hunting for mushrooms?
Yeah, so absolutely there are some really easy ones. I would say chicken of the woods is certainly an easy one. There are no toxic lookalikes and it is a pretty distinctive polypore that grows on wood. It is a beautiful orange and yellow mushroom that kind of grows in overlapping clusters on wood. And once you sort of see it or study it in a book, it's kind of unmistakable, really. So that would be one. The other group I would say are golden chanterelles, which are some of the most delicious mushrooms out there. And they cannot be cultivated because they need to make mycorrhizal association with trees. So you can't, we can't really affect how many chanterelles there are going to be each year because we can't cultivate them like we can the button mushrooms or oysters that you can readily get in the grocery store. So for chanterelles, you got to get out there into the woods and you got to find your spots and you got to get them from the wild. But chanterelles are really easy. They have ridges on the underside, not gills, not pores. And so that sort of makes them quite unmistakable because no other mushrooms sort of have that. And they sort of have this white stringy flesh. They smell of apricots, and they are bright yellow. So they're also kind of quite different. There aren't a lot of other yellow mushrooms like that. So chanterelles would be another one. Puffballs can also be quite easy to identify. Those are, they literally look like balls on the ground growing or from wood as well. And there really isn't anything else that kind of looks like that. And so puffballs can be a good entry mushroom as well. And there is an in-depth profile on all of these mushrooms that I have just mentioned in the book that kind of helps you figure out like where to look for them, how do you harvest them, what do they look like, and how can you kind of use them in recipes and stuff.
Yeah, and they all have beautiful pictures. I want to mention that. Like each one has such great pictures that are so useful in identifying as well. I know you kind of touched on this. You mentioned that there came a time when you were in the US that you needed kind of some space for grounding and reconnecting with nature. But what are the other benefits you've seen in your life from going out and regularly hunting for mushrooms?
Well, I think it's the time in nature, really, for me, because so much of our life is, or I'm sure for a lot of people, for me anyway, is I spend a lot of time in front of a computer in an office. And to be able to go into the woods and just completely disconnect just fills me with energy, really. There's no other way to describe it. And this phenomenon is well known. It's called forest bathing, and just spending time in the woods and in nature and doing, you can be photographing mushrooms or you can just be walking around, whatever it is, but just spending time in nature, I think for me is really good for my mental health, as well as just you're moving around, so that's good for my health as well.
I love that. I definitely have always kind of felt a draw to that when I'm feeling wintertime is always the time I feel a little like discombobulated of like I need more time out in nature
Yep.
because yeah, that forest bathing is such a real thing. I also wanted to ask you at the end of your book you have a section of recipes that you can use with the fungi. So, what
Yeah.
are some of your favorite recipes that you would recommend to the people listening to cooking with these mushrooms once they found them?
Yeah, so I think one of my absolutely favorite recipes is the dill soup with poached eggs, which is a traditional Czech South Bohemian recipe. It's one of my favorite soups and quite possibly meals to make. And you can make that with a wide variety of mushrooms, whether they're wild, foraged, or store bought. So the soup is excellent with just button mushrooms from the store. And it is just such a great combination of flavors where you kind of have this creamy base of a mushroom broth, or, you can use chicken stock or vegetable stock as well. That's sort of accompanied by dill, potatoes, and mushrooms. And then you put a poached egg on top of it. So it really is this dance of traditional kind of Czech flavors. So that would be one. I would say a more American one possibly is the buffalo chicken of the woods pizza, which is one of my favorites as well. So if you find chicken of the woods, that is absolutely the way to go, which has, ranch dressing and has blue cheese and red onions as well. And of course, the buffalo sauce and awesome dough. So can't go wrong with that.
Yeah, I'm gonna put some bookmarks by both of those. I appreciate that you been like an American recommendation, because a lot of my listeners are in America, but those both sound delicious. And are there any benefits to eating fungi and eating mushrooms?
Yes. So mushrooms are high in, they have a high nutritional value. So they are rich in nutrients. They are low in calories, but rich in sort of essential nutrients like vitamins and minerals and dietary fiber. They are high in protein, which, makes them a great replacement for meat, and therefore that's what kind of makes them sustainable food source as well, because they require less resources like land, water, and energy to create or to produce than sort of other agricultural crops that we create. And because they are high in protein and low in calories, they are a great option for weight management. So sort of replacing, your beef burger with a portobello burger really can make a big difference in terms of calorie intake, and still make you feel full and satisfied as well. And a lot of people talk about sort of the medicinal properties of mushrooms, but I kind of want to be careful about some of the statements that we make about that. While mushrooms have been studied for a lot of different reasons and potential in terms of medicinal benefits, we still have a lot more research to do to prove that they indeed are medicinal and can be compared to sort of other medicines. But lots of mushrooms have they have all sorts of good stuff in them. So they have been studied for immune support. They have compounds that can enhance immune function. They can both boost immunity. They have been studied for that, but they can also sort of help with potentially for people after transplants. Mushrooms have been studied for heart health because they include nutrients that help lower cholesterol levels and sort of reduce inflammation and all these sorts of good things. They also have tons of antioxidants, which, are good for us. They help protect the body. Lots of mushrooms have been studied for their potential anti-cancer properties. So, mushrooms like turkey tails and reishi and maitake or even shiitake have bioactive compounds that might have these anti-cancer properties and be helpful during sort of supportive therapies during cancer treatments. The fiber that they contain can also act as prebiotics, so promoting sort of gut health and things like that. So mushrooms have a lot of potential in this area, and lots of mushrooms like reishi and cordyceps and lion's mane have gained a lot of fame for their potential medicinal properties. But again, I kind of want to stress that we just don't know enough yet to be able to fully support these claims. And no mushroom will certainly cure cancer or make you more creative or things like that, as
Yeah.
some of those products sort of claim, right? So it's
Yeah.
always important to do your research. I mean, for people in certain conditions, certain mushrooms can be, harmful. They can make the situation be worse. So I tend to think of, like, same way, for example, when, people are on blood thinners, they shouldn't eat a lot of vegetables that contain vitamin K, because that's going to make it even worse, right? It's going to thin the blood even more.
Mm-hmm.
The same goes for mushrooms, right? So it's just like any other food source that we can eat. It can be harmful and it can be beneficial in many ways.
Yeah.
So just, I would like the listeners to know that yes, mushrooms are getting a lot of press in terms of health benefits, but make sure you do your research. And a lot of these products do not have they don't even have the right ratio of what they're supposed to be made of, so sometimes there's too much other stuff and not enough of the mycelium or the mushroom that is supposed to have these benefits. So I would just caution against that.
Yeah, I think it's important to have that healthy dose of skepticism when there are claims that seem too good to be true. I've definitely seen those. I feel like anytime I get into like the medicinal properties in the plant world too, it's the same
Yeah.
thing of like this isn't all proven. A lot of these are preliminary studies. And in the end, I
Yep.
usually walk away with the feeling of eat like a variable diet with lots of like fresh and raw foods, and
Right.
like food is very healing, and mushrooms are included in that. They can be very healing for
Yep.
our bodies. um
Exactly.
so Barbara, thank you so much for coming on. I just want to give you like have a quick moment to shout yourself out. If people want to find your book, where can they go? If they want to follow you, where can they go for that?
Yeah, thank you. So I am primarily most active on Instagram. So my handle is at Fungi Woman. I post daily where I hope to inspire and educate about a particular mushroom species. I also share lots of stories of my adventures in the woods, and I post lots of educational quizzes, so kind of make it fun. So Instagram is the place to be for the social media. And then of course my book is, you can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all other sort of major book retailers out there. And
Awesome.
yeah, I hope you love it.
Sorry, I can't say enough like good things about your book too, because like I said, as a beginner, it was the perfect introduction for me. So if any of you listening are interested in learning more about mushrooms, look up Hunting Mushrooms by Barbara Batakova. Wonderful book. And again, thank you for coming on. This has been like delightful to learn from you. I can definitely tell that this is, a passion for you, and you are so knowledgeable about this. It's been so fun to learn more about this. So thank you again for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here and for listening to the Plant School podcast. I hope that you will join me for our next episode. And if you would like to support this podcast and keep it going, there's a link down in the show notes of this episode where you can donate to this podcast. And I really appreciate all that help. or you can go to my merch store, which is also linked in the notes of this episode, and you can find some really cool plant-related shirts and stickers. And if you want to support the podcast but spend no money, feel free to share it with a friend, leave a review. All these things greatly help me out and allow me to keep doing this. Again, thank you so much for listening and for being here at the Plant School Podcast.